Well, it's been quite a journey for Cyril Ramaphosa. 30 years ago, he was holding the microphone as Madiba delivered that famous speech on the Grand Parade. Today, he is the country's president, the leader of the so-called New Dawn. Of course, South Africa has come a long way, but in a sense, Ramaphosa's republic is stuck in the past. Let's get some perspective. Our reporter, Michael Marilia, joining me now. Michael, looking at that special report on inequality, what did you find?
Yeah, some fascinating numbers, Jane, and as you said, very much a state of two nations, a country characterized by fences and walls, a country of the haves and the have-nots. So let's get started and take a look at some of those numbers, and the President, of course, will be hoping to address this in his speech tonight, Jane. This figure really divides the country into 10 groups, starting with the poorest 10% and working all the way up to the richest 10%, Jane. And as you can see, the richest 10%, in terms of spending, well, they spend 52.6% of all the money in South Africa. The poorest 10% spend less than 1%. So just bear that figure in mind. Just 10% of the population, in terms of the money that they have at their disposal, it's almost half of all the funds that are spent in this country. Let's talk rands and cents, and I'll just try and bring it home for you as we take a look at that same study and just explore it in a slightly different way. Imagine all the money in the country that South Africans have to spend is 100 Rand note. Well, if we focus on the richest 10%, Jane, they are going to take up 52 Rand 60 cents. Remember, this is just a fraction of the population, 10% of the population, and they get more than 50 Rand out of that 100 Rand note. The second richest, they have much less, but still, Jane, a fair amount. They're going to get around about 17 Rand 50 out of that original 100 Rand. And bear in mind, if we were living in an equal society, each group would get 10 Rand each, but that is certainly not the case in South Africa. If we focus on the next group, and that's Group 8, they get slightly below that 10 Rand average. They're getting 9 Rand 50. But this is where it gets particularly interesting, Jane. If we go to Group 5, so that would be the lower middle class, roughly, you'd expect them to get around about 10 Rand, because if in an equal society, everyone would get roughly the same. Not the case, Jane. They only get 3 Rand 30. Just 3 Rand 30. And if we fast forward all the way, Jane, to the poorest 10% in South Africa, I'm afraid to say they're getting just 80 cents. 80 cents compared to 52 Rand that the richest 10% are getting. That clearly is a problem. Let's focus very quickly on our next graphic, and that's the Palmer ratio, Jane. And what this does is it looks at the poorest 40% of the population and compares it with the richest 10%. Now, the poorest 40%, the population is, of course, 4 times bigger than the richest 10%. So you might expect them to earn substantially more than the top 10%. It's not the case, I'm afraid. In fact, this report reveals that the top 10% are earning 9.7 times more, Jane, than the bottom 40% in South Africa. 9.7 times more. And of course, bearing in mind, we are 25 years into democracy. We're still dealing with the legacy of apartheid, but some will say far too slowly. Jane?
All right, I mean, those are pretty disturbing. I want to paraphrase the late Chris Hani. He said he feared that the, quote, liberators would emerge as elitists, living in palaces and trying to gather riches.
Yeah.
Hey, here we are. Do the numbers justify that?
Well, let's take a look at that very quickly, and we'll compare the overall inequality rate in South Africa with the inequality rate amongst black South Africans. So we have one of the highest inequality rates in the world, Jane. That is 7.9, so that's all South Africans put together. But let's focus on inequality amongst black South Africans. And analysts are saying, Jane, that this is a concern. It's 4.8. It's lower than the overall inequality rate. But what they're saying is there's an emergence of a black elite or a black middle class, and they've benefited from democracy, but many other black South Africans have been left behind. So that inequality rate of 4.8 is a major concern, especially 3 decades after Nelson Mandela walked free.
Michael, thank you very much.